Doherty, Mary Doherty, welcome to Business Insider.
Thank you, Mark.
Lovely to see you here.
Good to be here, thank you.
The challenge, and truly I don't know where to start with you, girl. We might start with how did we get here, because you have been travailing the Central Coast for some decades now. Is that reasonable?
Well, we moved here about 22 years ago.
Okay.
I married an Australian.
Mm-hmm.
I tell everybody, you know, I married an Australian in Ireland and they deported me afterwards.
We do that. Yes.
But it was the best move I've ever made. Australia has just such wonderful potential. And interestingly enough, I remember the first time I came to the Central Coast, I was invited for a weekend, came up by train, saw the sparkling water, the beautiful views, and fell in love. And still am, passionately.
That's cool, that's cool. So that was 22 years ago?
22 years ago.
Okay, okay. In that time, you've had a couple of roles. I'd love you to think about 2 or 3 events that won't lead to legal action, that you look back on and say, yeah, I learned a lot from there, and this is what I learned. What's the number one event, you know, if you look back over those 22 years that's helped mould your career, your business?
I think the very first one was when I first came to live on the Central Coast. Our daughter was young, just started school here. I was bored, started looking for something to do, was offered a Girl Friday job in a printing company here. The printing company was in not the best health. As a Girl Friday, my job was just to do as I was told. And very quickly I understood where the difficulties were. So I started talking to management about some of the things that they could improve to lift the company and to get themselves out of a bit of trouble. As I started to do that, and as they started to listen and see some of the good results, needless to say, I didn't stay as a Girl Friday too long. Still paid as a Girl Friday, mind you. And in the end, the general manager asked me if I would take over his job and run the company, still on a Girl Friday's pay. But for me, it was about the challenge. It was to see whether or not that I could turn a company around. And I did. Within 6 months, it was a completely different company. After a year,
You look back now and say, okay, what? Yeah, 6 months. There were some significant issues. What do you recall of those issues? Yeah.
Processes, and processes.
Right.
The other 3 things for me that are really important is transparency, responsibility, and accountability. Mm-hmm. So everybody was pointing the finger at everybody else, but as soon as we defined roles, put processes in, gave people KPIs, which are absolutely vital, and people realized that they had a responsibility, things started to move along. And interestingly enough, when I went there first, the culture wasn't very happy. But as people were given defined roles, strong guidelines, understanding of how other people's jobs affected one another, it was a completely different place to be. It was really, really fantastic, and it was good to, because I actually came from a business background in Ireland and Europe as well. So when I came to Australia, you know, I had to learn the language, and Australians do speak Australian, they don't speak English, which was very interesting, but I had an absolute ball learning the culture. And Australians have a very interesting culture, very similar to the Irish, but with a lot of English reserve in them. And then the multiculturalism, although I prefer to call it integration, because I believe that culture is about the country you come from. I think when you go to a country, you become part of that culture. And integration was very much part of what I did. And that was an interesting journey. I went home.
How long were you at the printing company for?
I was there probably for about 1.5 years, then went back to Ireland for 2 months, resigned because I thought I might not come back to Australia, because I'd promised my husband to give Australia 2 years, then go back to Ireland and decide whether or not I wanted to return or stay here. And I just couldn't wait to come home, and home was Australia and has been ever since.
Nice, okay. next most powerful moment? We fast forward probably to the start of 2000s and your participation at a very senior level on the coast with
the business chamber.
Tell me a couple of things that happened there and what you've learned from that.
Well, I've learned a lot of things from there. One of the things that I've certainly learned is that as an organisation, the business chamber had no visibility in the region, and yet the business chamber was certainly in Sydney and other regions quite strong. It was a bit like the Central Coast itself. People travelled to Sydney, 45,000 people every day travelled to Sydney, but they lived on the Central Coast and weren't too sure whether there were Sydney people or whether there were Central Coast people. And one of the things that I realised after doing a lot of research, talking to a lot of businesses, talking to the media itself and government, that it needed a sense of identity. And so I set about doing a lot of research to see where the identity needed to be and what the culture of the Central Coast was.
Have we got that? Have we evolved since then?
I think we have a little, not as much as...
I need a scale. Have we moved 15%? Have we moved 30%?
No, I think we've moved probably about 45%.
Okay.
And I think there was 3 things that did that. When I first came here, the Central Coast did not have a geographical footprint at all. And a guy called David Meehan, believe it or not, looked at it geographically and got the Geographical Society to effectively recognise it as a region. Then I had a look to see what needed to be done after that, because he and I spoke about it. He asked me if I would support him in it. I said, of course I would, because that is something for me, that if a region or a country doesn't have a culture, it doesn't have a heartbeat. If it's not tribal, it doesn't know where it belongs.
I go back to that, Mary, though, and I think absolutely the recognition as a great place to start is the geography, then the Bureau of Statistics, which you pushed that through.
Well, the Bureau of Statistics was very interesting. I realised that we would never get funding. The government would continuously say to me, yes, we've given the Central Coast funding. And I said, well, where is it? And they said, we give it to the Hunter and Central Coast. And so my response to that was, that's all very well and fine, but how much has actually come to the Central Coast? And when I actually looked at it...
Yeah. I want to come back. I know the battle, and politicians forget the role that New South Wales Business Chamber had in pushing that through. They will put their hands up and suggest, it was me that actually pushed it through, when in actual fact, the people who know where it came from, it was Mary. Following all of that, we've talked to a lot of people about how do we generate that heartbeat. We've got the body lying on the slab somewhere between Pearl Beach and Gorican, I should say, anywhere to the north, or Lake Munmora, Guanderland. It's now getting that beat happening. Do you see any change in that, or do you see the beat?
Oh, I do. But I think we haven't, on the Central Coast, we haven't put our hands on our hearts and say, I love the Central Coast. I am part of the Central Coast.
Yeah.
Why
not? What stops us doing that?
Look, I believe what stops us doing that is everyone has a different opinion of how it should be done. And so everybody waits for somebody else to do it and then hops on the bandwagon. A bit like the Bureau of Statistics. I continuously went to them, I continuously spoke to them. I've become really good friends with them now. It normally takes about 25 years to get anything changed. They did it in 3 years. I thought they were slow. They thought I was extremely fast.
Yeah.
Go figure.
Yeah.
Go figure. But the thing is, they're willing to help us to do whatever is necessary now to grow the region and that heartbeat. In the same way as Craig Thompson came to me with an idea about I Love the Central Coast. He asked me to help. I said, yes, I would be prepared to do it. I did a lot of work in my own time for I Love the Central Coast. I registered the name. I've also trademarked the I Love the Central Coast. In the coming months, you'll actually see it pick back up again because Chris Harcher, Barry O'Farrell, Chris Holstein, they are now all behind it, because unless we see those stickers on the back of cars, unless people are willing to drive everywhere and people say, where are you from? I'm from the Central Coast, and boy, do I love it.
It comes back to, I think, that point about the tribal culture. And we've identified, and Bob particularly has a theory on the silos around the Central Coast, and they are quite high silos.
But you know what's interesting about a silo? Sometimes it rusts and falls over.
Yes.
And that's where we are on the Central Coast. Bob and I agree on that. Bob and I have been on boards together where we've talked about that and seen it. I believe that in the work that I was doing was about breaking down those silos. Some people found it very confronting because they had a certain point of view and have done for 45 and 50 years. Well, that's not progress. In today's changing society, nothing stays the same for very long. We see it on Facebook, we see it on Twitter, we see it in the media. We see what's happening in the world today. The Arab countries where before nobody would have dared stood up. Well, because of the internet and the social media, we're seeing change around the place. If the Central Coast doesn't change, that F3, that vein that takes people from Sydney to Newcastle will continue to be there, and people will forget what's around it. And yet we have 310,000 people here, great people, great businesses, great culture, great art, great musical ability, great actors come from here. The literary people that are here are phenomenal, and yet nobody knows.
Well, hopefully you keep talking about what you're talking about, and this is our little advertisement for Business Insight. We want to, and we share that passion, Mary. We share the ideal that there are a lot of smart, in every sense, clever, wise people here on the coast, but we don't get to see enough of them. And
you know what was interesting, Mark? I did, and I still do.
Yeah.
And I am absolutely amazed that we have such talent here. And it's about bringing out those talents, showcasing them. It's not all about the negative, and all we hear is the negative. Woe is the Central Coast. Oh, woe is us. Oh, things are really bad.
We had Ben from Click Mobile Technologies in here. He's
fabulous character, love him.
26. He is running as Chief Technology Officer, the technological development of, and we call it Silicon Valley, or I know Alan calls it Silicon Valley equivalent. And you'll be able to see his interview on Business Insider. But it is all about revealing those people and those success stories. Paul Freeman from the EBS Print. Amazing stories that people need to. Here's the challenge. Here's a theory that you could perhaps pursue for me. We are torn between being in God's own country here and not wanting to stir up too much trouble, because if we get too good, we'll be swamped, and these horrible people from Sydney will come up here and they'll spoil us.
Mark, it's happened, darling. It's already happening. It's happened, and it's going to continue to happen. So we either present ourselves as the place to be and get the creme de la creme.
Indeed.
Or we become the dumping ground. And I think I would prefer the creme de la creme rather than the dumping ground.
We mentioned 45% there.
Mm.
Okay, we can, if we've got a target of being 90% there in the next 10 years, what do we do, Mary? What do we need to do more of?
I think, like you and Bob have already mentioned about the silos, I think the people that have been guarding those silos need to surrender. They need to put up the white flag and say, perhaps my way isn't the only way. Perhaps it's time for me to allow other people the chance. Perhaps it's time I became part of the solution rather than the problem. And I found that in my role certainly the most frustrating, because I'm used to change, I'm used to outcomes, I'm used to getting things done. And I found that other people were afraid of the outcomes. They talked about it, but they were actually afraid that if they allowed it to happen, that they may not be, a bit like a tsunami, that they may get swept away. But in a good sense. I don't mean a tsunami in a bad sense, but in a good sense. Because sometimes you need that clearing. It's a bit like in Australia we have bushfires, and the Aboriginals used to set them to clear the land, but it also helped to regrowth. And in some ways we need that. And we need them to surrender and say, let me be part of the solution, and it's time to allow somebody else to be part of the solution.
We might give you your rant moment. I may have heard some of your rant already, but if you've got 60 seconds to talk about what really gets up Mary's nose, what would you talk about?
I thought about that question, and I thought I actually don't want to rant, because to me when you rant it's about anger and frustration, and I think the time for anger and frustration is over. I think the time now is for doing something. We'll see a change within New South Wales. That's part and parcel of how things work. We have a government leader coming in who is a moderate and who believes in good outcomes. I've certainly spoken to him, and I've told him that we will hold him accountable long before there was anything else spoken about. I told him that we would give him a scorecard on his and the new MP's ability to see and help get outcomes for the Central Coast and the rest of New South Wales. And I believe that people want to change. They want things, they want the environment to be good here. They want jobs. Instead of having everything at one story, whether we like it or not, people's business can be on the ground floor. And like the rest of Europe and America, you put units and apartments overhead so that we can get the tribal thing happening, we can get the village thing happening, we can actually start to see a place like Gosford arise like a phoenix from the ashes. Because that's all it is now, is ashes.
Indeed.
And people are in there struggling for a livelihood, and we need to help them. We need to help with the revitalization, and we need to support it. Even if somebody makes a decision that we might not necessarily agree with, let's support them.
And let's move forward.
Absolutely.
And learn.
You've asked me, for example, in 10 years' time, what would I see the culture of the Central Coast being? I believe we'll be something like Canberra. Not that we have the federal government there, but that art, that seaside, relaxing area that people go to. It will be about tourism. It should be about tourism. It should be about people coming in to experience the wonderful nature and assets and services that we have here. It's about a place, a restful place. when you look at some of the Aboriginal names here, Woi Woi, for example, means deep water. Yumaina Etalong, place to live, place to sleep. So when you actually have a look, the Aboriginals themselves saw it as whale country because they used to spend time watching the whales going by. They went into the bush because the bush gave it food. People can walk there, they can go on hikes to see the wonderful area that we have. In the future, people will need that rest. They will need a restful place. But it's not just that restful place. There's a buzz behind that too, because when people come here, it means that we've got to feed them. It means that we've got to look after them. So the service industries is where the Central Coast is heading. People talk about we need big companies here. It'll never really happen because the Central Coast topography isn't inclined that way. We don't have mines and we don't want them, because if we have open cut mines here, it affects our water system. We have people sucking out the very life of the Central Coast in bottled water. That needs to stop. It will take 100 years to replenish. What we do need to do is look at the culture of where we are now and not quite become a Gold Coast, but become part of a Gold Coast and part of a culture area. That when people think about where shall I go for the weekend? Well, darling, what about the Central Coast? It's so close. We can fly into Newcastle Airport an hour down the road and we're there. We can go by boat and go to the marina. And then we can go bicycling, we can go bushwalking, we can experience the wonderful restaurants. We can go to and have some fabulous conferences there. They're the things that we can do. It means all those small businesses that we have here on the Central Coast, all the marketing companies, all the candle makers, all the small manufacturers, places like Sanitarium and Master Food, food manufacturers can be manufacturing not only for the world but for also us here. Julie Goodwin is here. You know, so many great people are here. So that becomes the culture. Yes, people still go to Sydney to get work, and the young people will always do that because they need the much larger companies to grow. And what's to stop us being the educational capital of New South Wales? Why can't we have our own university? Why can't we have our own financial area of services? That is our culture. And yes, we can hop on a boat and in an hour we're at Sydney. We can also hop on a boat and be at Newcastle. We're an hour away from the wineries. But people go to the wineries and don't know what we have here. And that culture is starting to emerge. I'm seeing it with more.
How would you say, I'm not sure I get the culture. I get the industry. I get the skill sets. But I'm not sure I get the culture. What if you talk about Canberra? Yeah, it's politics and culture.
Mm.
Yeah, it's arts. We popped down and saw the Masters. Whatever. Is that how you see? Is that level of intent? It was quite a different sort of, I guess, profile, if you like, intellectual profile of Canberra. And that's getting closer to, they embrace the water and they embrace the sport and they embrace their government. Although they're not impressed with their government either. But but when it comes to defining our personality here on the coast,
that's what's emerging.
Smart?
We are smart. That intellectual arena through the arts as well as through education. That's where our culture is coming from. Lots of people don't even know that people like Clover Moore and Alan Jones have places up here and are up here regularly. People forget that people come here because they like the fact that they can talk to people. The amount of book clubs that are going on in the place is phenomenal. So it's that intellectual arena that drives all the rest, and that drives that culture. In the same way as I know that Business Insiders is getting behind the I Love the Central Coast campaign, and what that means.
Did you say?
The same thing as happens with culture, and we're actually seeing more and more of that starting to amalgamate, and it's happening in an organic sense. It's not happening where the government comes in and says, right, we're going to get all the intellectual and artistic people together and this is what we're going to do. They try to do that for the film industry here, and what happens? It goes to Newcastle. I heard an interview the other day on ABC about, wasn't it great about what the Hunter Film Council is doing, and they said, oh, and it's the Hunter and Central Coast, but all the time during the interview, all they talked about was the Hunter. And so for me, it's about us taking back what belongs to us and not allowing other people to put the Central Coast as a byword. We are strong people. We are a good business area. We do help each other. And it's about letting people know that that's going on and being supportive of it. In the same way as Business Insiders have this great idea, and I think it's absolutely fantastic and really worthwhile, that becomes the culture. People starting to say, right, this is what we need here, let's do it together. Because alone we can't do it.
Indeed, we can't.
But together we become powerful.
So Mary, pushing that culture and development of our culture forward, how do we market that? Who does that fall to?
I think that's the issue, as Bob mentioned, about people coming in from Sydney or other regions and saying, we'll give you money, but you do it our way. And so we give up part of that identity. And that's the thing we've worked so hard for, is to get our identity on paper through, mind you, I have to admit, the only reason I should say that we have the Australian Bureau of Statistics name change so that we can actually now see what amount of funding that comes into the Central Coast. And that was my whole purpose in doing it, because I was tired of people saying they were giving us money but nobody could give me numbers. Now it means we get numbers. And it means that we have a voice.
Who has that voice, Mary? Who? Is it I Love Central Coast, or is it Business Insider, or should there be a body, perhaps an amalgamation? Maybe it's like the business chamber or the manufacturers chamber, where you get 4 or 5 key stakeholders together and say, we will project this to the outside world in everything we do, and all their members take a stake in that, because we can talk about it. And you can bring it to life in your little way, but if we are a coast, if we are a region, we've got to. So how do we push it further?
The only thing I can say to Business Insiders is watch this space.
All right.
Yep.
Mary, thank you.
Thank you.
A pleasure. And we're done.